It started with a letter taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was a package notice or some routine HOA update about lawn lengths or parking violations. But as I unfolded it, the bold red "Notice of Violation" hit me like a slap in the face. According to the HOA, I had committed a Class C violation for discharging a firearm within the neighborhood boundary, specifically for hunting. I was baffled. The land I was hunting on had belonged to my family for decades. It was wooded, isolated, and far from the residential streets. More importantly, it was outside the development itself, zoned for rural use and legally cleared for hunting. Yet here they were, finding me like I was some reckless threat to their suburban utopia. I called the HOA office the next morning, thinking there must be some mistake. A polite but firm woman informed me that multiple residents had expressed concern over hearing gunshots. She said it made people feel unsafe, even if I was on my own land. I tried to explain that everything I did was above board. I had the tags, the seasonal permits, and more than enough distance from homes. Her tone changed slightly, less polite now, more procedural. "We understand that, sir," she said, "but the community has voted to enforce noise and safety standards that apply even beyond direct property lines when public interest is involved." I asked how far that public interest extended. She didn't answer. I thought that would be the end of it. Maybe just a warning, some neighborly overreaction that would blow over. But the following week, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. It cited local municipal codes, HOA bylaws, and imposed a $500 fine for reckless activity adjacent to the community boundary. That was the phrase they used, not hunting, not firearm use, just reckless activity. Vague enough to cover anything they didn't like. It was clear they were painting me as some sort of rural menace. I refused to pay the fine. That's when things escalated. They started sending follow-up letters. Daily. Then came the threats of lien placement, as if I had violated my mortgage. They said repeated non-compliance could result in access restriction to shared HOA services, even though I barely used any of them. Still, the tactic was intimidation, plain and simple. And it wasn't just paper warfare. One evening, I found a group of residents standing just beyond my property line, staring into the woods where I usually hunted. One of them, a man in a golf hat and pressed chinos, called out, "We don't want gun nuts near our kids." The others nodded like he'd made some brave speech. I didn't respond. I just walked away. What stunned me wasn't just the HOA's overreach. It was how quickly people turned. Neighbors I'd waved to for years suddenly treated me like a threat. Parents pulled their children away when I passed on the sidewalk. One woman left a note on my truck windshield that read, "Go play cowboy somewhere else." It was like I committed some unspoken crime by not conforming to their version of what safe looked like. Hunting, in their minds, was something that belonged on TV shows or far-off wilderness, not near their curated trails and Instagram-ready dog parks. I went back through every HOA document I had, the bylaws, the covenants, the zoning maps. Nowhere did it state that their rules extended beyond their jurisdictional boundary. And yet, they had decided that the sound of my hunting rifle, even from a quarter-mile away, was a punishable offense. It was no longer about rules. It was about control. They didn't like something, so they set out to destroy it. And they were using their bureaucracy to do it. That was when something in me shifted. I wasn't just annoyed anymore. I was insulted. This wasn't just about a fine. It was about principle. I had played by the rules. I had respected their boundaries. But they hadn't respected mine. They had crossed the line. And if they wanted to play that game, I could too. Only I knew how to do it better. When I received the first notice, I genuinely believed it was a misunderstanding, a case of mistaken location or exaggerated complaints. I figured that once I clarified the legality of what I was doing, everything would settle down. After all, I wasn't some reckless guy firing shots in his backyard. I was on my own acreage, over 700 feet from the nearest home, deep into the wooded edge of my property, where I'd hunted quietly for years without incident. I followed every state regulation, had a valid hunting license, wore safety gear, and only hunted during legal seasons. But none of that seemed to matter to the HOA. Their argument, they said, wasn't rooted in legality. It was about community comfort and perception. In their eyes, what I was doing might have been technically legal, but made people feel uneasy. The phrase they kept repeating was disturbing the peace. Not illegal, not dangerous, just disturbing. As if I had committed some invisible crime by not fitting the suburban mold they wanted to project. One of the board members even told me, "It's not about the law, it's about the atmosphere we're trying to maintain here." That told me everything I needed to know. Their strategy shifted from warnings to social pressure. First, they called a meeting, specifically mentioning me by name in the agenda, without even notifying me ahead of time. I wasn't there to defend myself when residents stood up and said things like, "We don't want our children growing up near gunfire," or "What if a bullet strays?" The narrative was spreading fast, and it was fueled by emotion, not facts. A rumor started that I was shooting in the direction of the trail, completely false, but once that idea was in the air, no one cared about truth anymore. Some even began treating me like I was unpredictable or unstable. One woman who used to greet me at the mailbox now crossed the street when she saw me. Another guy stopped bringing his dog down our road altogether. I had done nothing to these people. I had lived here longer than most of them. But the HOA had succeeded in something powerful. They had turned a legal activity into a moral panic. And once people are afraid, they stop asking questions. The HOA took this fear and ran with it. They issued formal letters citing community cohesion and emotional distress. They warned me that repeated infractions could result in additional fines, legal action, or even forced mediation. Forced mediation over hunting. On my own land, I asked them to show me the exact bylaw I had violated. They couldn't. Instead, they referenced vague phrases like activities that negatively impact the peace and aesthetic of the neighborhood. It was pure manipulation. They were crafting their own legal language to push a narrative where I was the villain. I consulted a lawyer just to be sure I wasn't missing something. He reviewed the property lines, the HOA boundary, the city ordinances. His conclusion was blunt. They don't have jurisdiction, but they're betting you won't push back. And he was right. They were hoping I'd either pay the fines out of frustration or just stop hunting altogether to avoid more trouble. They wanted compliance without confrontation. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about hunting. It was about control. They didn't like the idea that someone was living by a different set of rules, even if those rules were perfectly legal. They wanted uniformity, predictability, and docility. And I represented the opposite. I wasn't loud, I wasn't aggressive, but I was independent, and that's what unsettled them the most. The fines continued. They started sending emails to all the homeowners warning them about ongoing behavioral concerns from adjacent landowners. It was subtle, but the message was obvious. They wanted to isolate me, to cast me as the outsider. And people bought it, not because they had evidence, but because they trusted the HOA to define the boundaries of safety and order. It became a social contract I had never agreed to, written in invisible ink and enforced by peer pressure. Even as I maintained my composure, the pressure built. I could feel it every time I stepped outside, the sideways glances, the whispers. My presence had become a statement, and they resented that. But I wasn't the one who had started this. I was the one who had been pushed. And once you push someone far enough, they stop playing defense. They start looking for ways to shift the balance. The hiking trail had always been a quiet feature of the neighborhood, a narrow, winding path cutting through the woods on the far edge of the development. It wasn't paved, it wasn't marked on any official HOA maps, and yet everyone treated it like it was part of their personal backyard. Joggers, dog walkers, couples with strollers. Every morning and evening, you'd see them drifting in and out of the trees, smiling and waving like they owned the forest. But I knew something they didn't. That trail wasn't part of the HOA's protected greenbelt. It ran directly across a patchwork of old, neglected parcels that hadn't been officially owned or claimed for years. And the HOA, in all their arrogance, had never bothered to check. For years, I'd watched the trail quietly, not because I cared what people did on it, but because it bordered the land I actually owned. The people who hiked it probably assumed it was part of some city easement or community-owned land. But it wasn't. Most of the land back there was either forgotten or left out of development deals decades ago. It had no signage, no fencing, and no formal records that tied it to the neighborhood. Still, the HOA encouraged people to use it. They even put up a bulletin board near the trailhead offering trail safety tips, as if it was an amenity they'd thoughtfully provided. That bulletin board stood right next to my mailbox. At first, I didn't mind. Let people walk. It was peaceful. No one bothered me, and I didn't bother them. But after the HOA started fining me, after they tried to make me the enemy for something I was legally allowed to do, I started seeing that trail differently. It wasn't just a path through the woods anymore. It was leverage, and it was theirs, or so they thought. I began asking questions. Who actually owned the land the trail crossed? Had anyone bothered to verify its status? What I found stunned me. With some digging through the county property records, I confirmed what I'd long suspected. Several of the trail's key sections, including the scenic overlook the community loved so much, were sitting on land that had defaulted to county ownership years ago due to unpaid taxes. The parcels had been forgotten in a shuffle of subdivision planning and never absorbed into the HOA boundary. They were publicly listed, unclaimed, and, best of all, for sale. Dirt cheap. I checked the zoning. Still rural. Still unrestricted. No conservation easements. No park designation. In short, it was up for grabs. And no one else had noticed. It was almost too easy. I submitted a quiet offer through a shell LLC. Standard practice when you want to avoid public attention. A few signatures, a transfer fee, and just like that, the most popular section of the neighborhood's beloved hiking trail now belonged to me. No announcement. No press. No need to raise suspicion. I wasn't interested in showboating. Not yet. I just wanted the facts. Clean, legal, undeniable. This wasn't revenge. This was chess. I waited. I watched. For weeks, nothing changed. People kept hiking the trail, smiling, snapping selfies, walking their labradoodles through land that was no longer theirs to wander. I installed a few hidden trail cameras, not to spy, but to document usage. The foot traffic was significant. Families, HOA board members, even the same people who had accused me of endangering the community, were out there daily, strolling across land I now owned. The irony was delicious. The HOA had tried to fine me for hunting on my land while their entire community was trespassing on mine. I started preparing. Surveyors marked the new property lines. No trespassing signs were printed, legal notices drafted. I wasn't rushing anything. This wasn't about emotion. It was about timing. I wanted everything airtight before I made a single move. I contacted a real estate attorney, ran the entire situation by him, and he gave me the green light. The land was mine. Their use of it was illegal. Any access, any footfall was a violation. And once I enforced that, they would have no legal recourse. The best part was that they had done this to themselves. In their eagerness to control, to shame, to push out anyone who didn't fit their HOA fantasy, they had forgotten the oldest rule of property: know your boundaries. They assumed everything around them was under their control. But it wasn't. And now, the land they'd taken for granted, the land they walked daily without question, belonged to the very person they tried to silence. After weeks of watching the community stroll across land that was no longer theirs to use, I knew it was time to move. But I didn't want to make a scene. That's not how I operate. The HOA thrived on spectacle, on control through public embarrassment and whispered warnings. I wanted to work in silence. Precision. Legality. I started by deep diving into the county's property records again. I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. Any long-lost easements, forgotten utility rights-of-way, or legal loopholes the HOA might try to exploit once they realized what was happening. I even paid a land use consultant to comb through the zoning documentation and topography records just to confirm there were no buried limitations. There weren't. The parcels were exactly what I needed: rural, unrestricted, with no official HOA jurisdiction, no overlapping rights, and no standing contracts. And most importantly, they all connected. It was a string of oddly shaped, wooded lots that, together, formed the backbone of the neighborhood's hiking trail. Some of the land even included access points where the trailhead began, disguised behind what looked like HOA-installed landscaping. They'd even built a wooden bench along one section, without any permits. That would become useful later. The purchase process was easier than I expected. The land had sat in limbo for years. A few of the lots had been tax defaulted and listed at auction multiple times without takers. Others were owned by out-of-state investors who'd long forgotten they had anything in the area. I made discreet offers through a legal proxy, using an LLC registered in a neighboring county under a generic name. That way, no one from the HOA would recognize the buyer or trace it back to me until it was too late. I negotiated directly with the county for the tax sale parcels. They were practically giving them away, eager to clear their books and hand off the liability. A few emails, some notarized forms, and within 3 weeks, those pieces were mine. The private lots took longer. I had to find the owners, most of whom had moved on with their lives. Some were surprised to hear the land still existed. Others thought the HOA had already absorbed it. None of them cared enough to negotiate hard. For the price of a used SUV, I acquired every last stretch of the path. Quietly, legally, permanently. Once the final deed was recorded, I contacted a land surveyor to mark the boundaries. I made sure everything was precisely mapped, no ambiguity. Then I filed the surveys with the county and requested updated GIS records. That meant when anyone looked up the area on public maps, my LLC's name would show up clearly across the entire trail. I wanted transparency, not for them, but for me. I didn't want this challenged later by some wild claim that the land was still community used or somehow public. It wasn't. It was mine, and every record showed it. With the land officially transferred, I turned my attention to enforcement. Not immediately. First, I installed new property markers, weatherproof and visible from every entry point. I posted laminated, no trespassing signs according to state code, with specific references to the trespass statutes and the penalties involved. I even went as far as installing trail cameras, not to catch people in the act, though they would, but to document their continued access after the signage was in place. Every footstep past the boundary line would now be legally actionable. I also drafted a cease and desist letter to the HOA, outlining the situation with all necessary documentation attached. Copies of the deeds, maps showing the parcels, photos of the trail structures they placed on my land, and a formal demand that they stop encouraging residents to use the property. I didn't send it yet. I was saving that for the right moment. But it was ready. Ironclad. The moment they pushed back, I would push harder, backed by county records and state law. During this time, I kept hunting. More carefully, more quietly, but still within my rights. I didn't want to give them anything new to twist into a story. But what gave me the most satisfaction wasn't pulling that trigger out in the woods. It was knowing that I had just outmaneuvered them completely. While they were busy mailing me fines, gossiping about reckless behavior, and patting themselves on the back in HOA board meetings, I had taken away something they truly valued. And they had no idea it was already gone. It didn't take long after the property was officially mine for the first confrontation to happen. A woman was walking her dog near one of the trail entrances when she saw the no trespassing sign. She stood there for a while, arms crossed, like she couldn't believe what she was reading. I watched from a distance as she took photos of the sign, her dog impatiently pacing at the end of its leash. Later that evening, she posted the pictures on the community message board with a caption that read, "What's going on with our trail?" That was the first ripple. The storm wasn't far behind. Within days, the HOA inbox was flooded. People were confused, angry, demanding answers. Some assumed it was a prank, others thought it was temporary. A few even assumed the HOA had decided to shut the trail down for renovations or liability reasons. But then more signs went up. More entrances were blocked. Then came the chains across the access points, not padlocked yet, but unmistakably clear. This wasn't a warning. It was permanent. The HOA board finally addressed the issue in their next meeting, a packed session with standing room only. I attended, sitting quietly in the back. Most people didn't know who I was or connect me to the situation. That changed the moment the board president held up my cease and desist letter. He read parts of it aloud, glossing over the legal weight and emphasizing the inconvenience. Due to a private acquisition, he said, the trail may no longer be available for recreational use. The murmurs around the room turned into outrage. People wanted answers. They wanted to know who bought the land, why it was being closed, what could be done to reverse it. The board didn't have answers. That was the beauty of it. They had assumed the trail would always be there, that its value was untouchable. But they built their illusion on land they didn't own, and now the illusion had cracked. The board president promised to look into possible remediation options, a term so vague it might as well have been a shrug. A few brave residents tried to ignore the signs. They stepped around them, ducked under the chains, and walked the trail anyway. That's when the trail cameras came in handy. I captured every trespass, every moment someone crossed onto my property after the signs had gone up. Then I mailed each violator a formal notice of trespassing. Not aggressive, just factual, with clear language citing state statutes and the penalties involved if repeated. I didn't press charges. I just wanted the message to land. The next time they saw the trail, they thought twice. The real impact came when the community started to feel the loss. That trail wasn't just a path in the woods. It was part of their daily routine, their social life, their self-image. It was where parents took their kids to explore nature, where early risers jogged before work, where friends met for morning walks and gossip. Without it, they had to adjust. Some tried to use public sidewalks, others drove to nearby parks, but it wasn't the same. You could hear the bitterness in their conversations. The HOA had promised them harmony and convenience, and suddenly, both were gone. I got emails from the HOA board, some polite, others less so. They asked if we could come to a mutual understanding. One of them proposed a land use agreement, basically asking if I'd allow limited trail access in exchange for a maintenance contract and some goodwill. I declined. Another one offered to revisit my fines if I'd consider reopening the trail. I didn't even respond. The irony was too rich. They'd fine me for using my land in a legal, responsible way. Now they wanted favors. Eventually, the HOA sent out an official notice to all residents, acknowledging the trail's closure and advising against unauthorized entry. They framed it as an unfortunate situation beyond their control, a property dispute they were working to resolve. But there was no dispute. The land was mine. The closure was legal. And the only thing they were really working on was damage control. People started talking, not just about me, but about the HOA itself. Whispers spread about mismanagement, overreach, and assumptions made without due diligence. Some residents demanded to know why the HOA had encouraged use of a trail they didn't own. A few board members stepped down quietly in the following months. It didn't make headlines, but it made an impact. For the first time, people were questioning the power structure they'd once trusted without hesitation. The mood in the neighborhood shifted in ways the HOA never anticipated. It wasn't just about the trail being closed or a few warning signs on trees. It was something deeper, something that stirred beneath the surface of suburban normalcy. People were rattled. The hiking path had been an unspoken part of their routine, their identity, their comfort zone. They had taken it for granted the way you assume water will come out when you turn the tap or the mail will show up at noon. And now it was gone. Not because of construction or environmental concerns, but because of me, the same neighbor they had tried to punish into silence. Some residents still refused to believe it. They thought the trail closure was temporary, that I was bluffing or trying to make a point before backing down. But days passed, then weeks. The gates stayed locked. The signs didn't disappear. No amount of community pressure, HOA newsletters, or softly worded emails changed a thing. Eventually, disbelief turned into frustration, and that frustration naturally needed a target. At first, they pointed their fingers at me. I was the outsider, the hunter, the one who had dared to challenge their picture-perfect harmony. But over time, something strange happened. That frustration started to turn inward. People began asking questions they should have asked long ago. Why didn't the HOA verify ownership before promoting the trail as a community feature? Why had they never formalized access or secured easements? Why were they so quick to fine me for doing something legal while overlooking their own liability and overreach? Residents began to realize what had really happened, that the HOA had assumed power they didn't actually have and tried to wield it against someone who knew how to push back. That realization didn't sit well with the people who had once stood behind them. I didn't parade around the neighborhood or rub anything in their faces. That wasn't the goal. I kept my head down, did my work, maintained my property, and let the situation speak for itself. But when the HOA finally invited me to a private meeting to revisit the misunderstanding, I accepted, not out of obligation, but because I wanted them to look me in the eye. They offered carefully worded apologies, framed their past actions as miscommunications, and asked if I'd consider a compromise that benefits both sides. It was wrapped in corporate language and false humility. They asked what it would take for me to reopen the trail. They offered maintenance support, legal liability waivers, even HOA-sponsored improvements to my land like gravel or fencing. One board member mentioned reinstating my hunting rights in the community charter, as if dangling permission in front of me for something they never had authority over in the first place. I listened politely to every offer. Then I declined them all, not because I wanted to be spiteful, but because I had already made my decision the moment they fined me. I was done negotiating with people who only respected power when it hurt them. When I left that meeting, their faces told me everything I needed to know. They weren't angry anymore. They were afraid. Not of me, but of what I represented. Someone they couldn't bully. Someone who had used their own arrogance against them. Someone who followed the rules better than they did and still won. That's what really shook them. They weren't used to being powerless. But now, no amount of emails, votes, or fines could undo what they'd started. Word spread fast. Some people supported me quietly, dropping a nod or a short comment at the post office. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A few residents tried to organize a petition asking the HOA to work harder to rebuild the relationship with affected landowners. It was a nice gesture, but it missed the point. The damage wasn't in the locked gate or the trail camera footage. The damage was in the trust that had been broken when the HOA decided that fear and control were more important than facts or fairness. In the months that followed, I watched the neighborhood shift. A new board election brought in some fresh faces, candidates who talked more about respecting property lines than enforcing arbitrary aesthetics. Residents asked better questions during meetings, read the fine print of community documents, and stopped taking the HOA's word as gospel. The culture was changing, slowly but surely, not because of speeches or protests, but because of consequence. Because they had seen what could happen when the quiet guy they tried to punish knew the rules better than they did and had the means to fight back.